it's me again. This time I am here on this glorious stage. Why, you ask? Am I on a stage? Well, there's a reason for that. I think this backdrop to our conversation is apropos, given that I am about to finish the first draft of Defying Gravity. About to finish, maybe a loose interpretation, but last night I hit the 60,000 word mark, and 60,000 words is usually my sweet spot for a story, because I find that, at least for my style, 60,000 words is a good amount of words, for me to have told a complete story. This time, however, it's going to go a little beyond that. But I'm guessing within a week, I will have this first draft done. And I can tell you something. I have never been so giddy about a book in my life. Why? Well, this particular story is really personal for me. I'm incredibly personal because it involves something that I experienced, at least on a certain level. And I think, to me, that has made some very compelling storytelling. And I think that's great. And I also know at the same time, and I'm sure that my fellow writers are listening to me thinking, oh, I don't know if I could do that. Because this is fiction. I have fictionalized something that I experienced in my life that meant so much to me. Now, I've thrown in a level of magic realism to the story to make it interesting for more people because, it could have really only held interest to a small niche of people, and I wanted to expand it out. And I think I've succeeded with this book. Now, it could be my own personal bias. Well, of course, it is my own personal bias, but blah, blah, blah. That's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is something that happened during the writing of this book that I only just recently realized. What I'm talking about is a parallel story. Now, the parallel stories, as the name would imply, follow along the main storyline in a parallel fashion. But they don't just follow along without bumping into the main story. They intersect and they inform. Let me give you an example. So you're watching a TV show. It doesn't matter which TV show it is. But the main character of the TV show has a very specific lesson to learn in that episode. And that lesson has to do with a character that they're dealing with, right? Or maybe not. Maybe it's a lesson that they have to learn about their job, or about life in general. Okay? So this character in the same episode is also dealing with a secondary character. And that secondary character is going through something also that is different, but in some way similar. And the main character gleans from the secondary character the lesson that they need in order to get through what it is they are dealing with in the main storyline. To me, that is a perfect example of a parallel story. And I'm not going to give anything away, of course, but that happened, and it happened without my knowing it. Early on in Defying Gravity, I wrote an instance, a very small plot point, that I wanted to add to give a little bit of a background for one of the secondary characters. Actually, more than a secondary character. It's the love interest of the main character. So that character, I felt, needed this little bit of backstory. Well, that backstory kept popping back up. And it popped up and it popped up and it popped up. And it wasn't until something else happened, and I'm trying to be very cryptic and vague, but something else happened between the main character and that parallel story that gave it this whole new life, a life of its own. And that parallel story started to inform the main character in a way that I hadn't planned or predicted. It just happened. It was organic, and it was incredibly wonderful when I realized what had happened right under my nose. It was like, whoa, oh my gosh, yeah, that is exactly. And then once I realized it, then I could weave it in a little bit more and a little bit deeper. And that parallel story started to intersect with the main story in such a way that they almost became one and the same. Now, the problem with this is, and this has happened to me long ago, way back when I plotted all of my stories out, I used outlines. And as I'm outlining these books, I would realize that I needed a secondary plot, a parallel plot to go along with the main story. So the readers could go, I see where this is going. I see how this is going to inform the main story. Or maybe they can't see it, but they understand that something is happening in the background that is not just as important, but that is important. But the problem is when I found myself having to write them in with an outline, they were forced. And they were never natural. And so when I started writing without a net, those parallel stories would just pop up. They would just happen organically. And in that, they felt more real and more honest. And in this case, it was so eye-opening to me. It was almost like, well, duh, of course that's what happens to this main story. And because the thing is, it's not like My Muse where it's like this Russian nesting doll of plot. But there is one aspect of the main story that happens to the main character, and it starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then when the secondary plot intersected with that main story, it all just sort of made sense. It's like, that's why that was happening. That's why the universe had me put that kernel of a parallel plot in at the beginning of the story and made it grow, because it had to be there towards the end so everything else could make sense. And when that happens naturally, organically, without you having to force it, it is a thing of wonder. And you know that the readers, as they're reading this, they're going, oh, I get it now. It's the same thing when you're watching television, and good writing on television does the same thing. Right now we are watching a show called Unforgotten, and there are all these parallel things going on, and you know by the end of this first season, those parallel things are all going to intersect into one plot. They have to, because they're making such a big deal about each one of these 7 or so plots. And the beautiful thing as a reader, as a watcher, as a listener, is when those things come together, it creates something bigger and more important and more incredible than you would have had without them. So you might think that you would have all of these different plots going on, that's the big thing in this book. No, the big thing is when they all come together to expand the universe of the main character in such a way that it would not have expanded otherwise. And it's amazing. And if you're a writer of anything, of television, of plays, of books, of poetry, of whatever, you've got to pay attention. And that's something that, as an actor, when I was in graduate school, one of the things that we hit the hardest was active listening. You have to not only hear what your partner is saying, you have to hear how your partner is saying it, you have to hear the context in which your partner is saying what they say and how they say it. Your ears and your eyes and everything, every part of you has to become actively involved in the hearing. And as a writer, you have to do the same thing. You have to pay attention to the minutia, the finest, the smallest detail of your characters and of the scenes and of the story arc and of the universe that you're creating, because there's going to be these little cues that the universe is going to give you that tells you that there is something else going on outside of your main plot that you must pay attention to and you must develop. And if you ignore those things, the audience is going to know that you ignore them. And they're going to say, by the time they finish your book, they're going to think, well, why did they leave this unresolved or undone or unfinished? There was something else wonderful happening on the sidelines, and the author just let it go. You've got to pay attention. You've got to actively listen as you write. And that's exactly what I had to do when I wrote this book. It's because I added these things on the side, and I had to pay close attention so I knew which of those things were important and which of those things were just blips in the plot. And when I realized I subconsciously realized what was important, the subconscious writer in me said, no, we got to keep bringing this back up. We've got to keep bringing this back up and allow it to grow and allow it to grow and allow it to intersect with the main plot. So it could not only inform it, but it could grow it and make it more interesting and give it depth. And in the end, that secondary plot will help the main plot to resolve in a natural way. It's an amazing thing when it happens without you knowing it. So, writers, let it happen. Pay attention. Pay very close attention to what you're writing. And even pay attention to what you're not writing. That's even harder. Because just like as an actor, you not only, as an active listening actor, you not only have to pay attention to what you're hearing, you have to pay attention to what you're not hearing. Yeah, it gets complicated. But the more complicated it is, the better you are, the better story you've told. Anyway, that's all I have to say right now, Muse. I'm sure that we'll come back and we'll talk about this again sometime. Hopefully it will be inspired by yet another instance of magical storytelling. Anyway, thank you, Muse, for listening to me. Thank you for giving me all of these wonderful ideas. And I hope that you are safe and you are dealing with this crazy world we're living in right now in such a way that is helping you to be creative and bring your stories to life. Why, Muse? Because you are awesome.